I read it. I then talk to you about whether it needs any changes, because I will have a view on whether it needs a bit of editorial help to get a publisher interested, what kind of publisher. And when I think it's really tip top, and with your agreement, I will then send it out to the market, which is essentially the big publishers. And what happens is that these big publishers, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin, Random House, they will, their editors will hopefully read it quickly, because the power of a literary agent is their reputation. And if you have provided good books previously, they hopefully will pay attention to the books you are sending them now. And in a sense, that's what a literary agent's job is. It's very much on their own time and their reputation. Every time I send a book out to an editor, I'm essentially putting my name on the line here. So for me, it's a very big choice to take on a new client. And I'll explain what that process is in a minute. But essentially what a literary agent does is send out to the market. The publishers hopefully go mad for this book that they're really excited about. I give them a vision of how they could market it, perhaps tell them why I think they need this book, because where it fits in their publishing list and why it has value. Now, of course, a manuscript at the point it's given to me has no value, because it's just paper and words. But what I'm trying to get from publishers is a commercial value for this, for the rights. And that's obviously a very difficult thing to quantify. And many authors say to me, well, what is my advance going to be? And a lot of the time, I simply don't know, because I'm going to check out several different publishers and let them fight it out among themselves until I feel it sort of feels about right. And obviously over the years, you get an instinct for what you think a book is worth. And so if someone does make an offer and you think it's way below what it should be, you can do something about it. And when I say an offer, I'm talking about an advance. So a publisher pays an author an advance on his or her royalties. So that means they pay money up front, and then the author redeems more money after that advance is earned out. So you pay an author £10,000 or £100,000 on for the book, and then when the book is sold a year later in the bookshops, the royalty that comes back earns that advance out, and after that you start earning royalties. And that's how authors make their living, really. So an agent is there to get as good advance as they can with the right publisher for that author. So the literary agent's job is, at its most basic level, a salesman. Their job is to sell someone's creative work. But I think it's evolved, even in the 20 odd years that I've been involved in working in this area, into something much bigger than that. We're now involved in marketing, publicity, and virtually every aspect of an author's life. I mean, I represent now quite a wide range of writers, some nonfiction, some fiction, some cookery, some in all different areas. And every single one of them is different and has different needs. So I would say that the literary agent's job is part negotiator and contracts person, but also part sort of consigliere, if anyone remembers The Godfather. It's that person that you can trust. It's that person who is a sort of co-conspirator. You're linked to your agent for many, many years, mostly, and you have to have a relationship of total and utter trust. So an agent has to make a decision quite quickly on a person's work that may well bind them together for many, many years. And also for authors, it's very hard, because when you start your career, you don't have as many choices as you would like. And you may end up picking the wrong agent. And you're stuck with someone who never really believed in you, who's doing it because they made a quick buck on the first book, but essentially doesn't really want to do anything more with you. And that's a very complicated and difficult relationship. But every author deserves their champion. And that is what a literary agent is, really. But also you can become an analyst and a psychiatrist. I mean, I have many authors much older than me who ask me advice, which I'm woefully underqualified to give. But they feel that because of the relationship we have, that there is a trust there, that they know I will be what I think is most important about being a literary agent, which is an objective friend. I am there because I believe in them. I like their writing. I think they have a reason to disturb everyone's life by spending $14.99 on their hardback. For me, it's absolutely crucial that I believe in them. And then they also have to trust that I will tell them the truth. And the truth is very hard. I remember one of my authors you know, the hardest thing as a literary agent is when you get a book by an author you really like and you trust and respect, who delivers a novel that isn't really up to scratch. It just isn't as good as it could be, or maybe it's the wrong timing. And I had one author who I remember very early on in my career, who gave me that terrible dilemma. She sent in her book, I read it, and I just knew deep down that it probably was publishable. It was her second book. Her first book was mildly successful, but she was beginning of a quite interesting career. But this book was not going to do anything for her. And so I thought, well, what do? Do I send it to a publisher who will reject it? And I can hide behind that and say, look, let's try again. Do I ask her to edit it, but with the knowledge that I know that even if she rewrote it 3 or 4 times, it's still not going to be the book that's going to do it? Or do I tell her the truth? And of course, if I tell her the truth, she may say, well, you're not the agent for me. You don't believe in me. And those are the kind of dilemmas you have. And in the end, with that author, I did, and actually I have ever since, but I did tell her the truth. We sat down and she'd spent 18 months on this novel. And obviously she was a bit depressed. And she said, I remember she sat there and said, and you know what? I'm pregnant. And I went, oh dear. And so I've got to make some money before I have this baby. And, you know, what are we going to do? And I said, well, is there anything else that, you know, have you got any other ideas for other books? And she sort of thought about it. She said, well, look, there's this picture I've got in my room. And I always look at this painting and I think, I wonder what the story of the girl in that painting is. And I remember thinking, well, that sounds like a book. Why don't you write that? Just do it quickly. And it was no more than 6 months later, she did deliver the novel. And it was called Girl with a Pearl Earring. And Tracy Chevalier, that book happened just through sheer luck to go on and sell 5 million copies. And, you know, she's now written her 18th novel, I think, or no, maybe it's about her 15th novel. So that was a sort of happy moment for me and a learning point where I realized the truth is what it's about. And you know, you can have authors as distinguished as John le Carré, who's been writing since before I was born, obviously, and for 60 years he's been writing novels. I mean, there is nothing on earth that I could teach him. If anything, he teaches me every day. But the fact is, he's still, every writer, when they hand over a book to another person, however experienced, clever, brilliant, talented they are, they just don't know. And that is the magic of being in the creative industry, is because I don't know, but I have a feeling and I have a gut instinct and I have some experience. So what I do is I share that, and that's what they respond to. And that to me is a very exciting creative moment in anyone's, you know, life, working with writers, and they're very varied. But essentially, going back to what literature does, is I'm there to guide them through, make difficult decisions with them, know which battle to fight. Because often with publishers, you know, there's a huge amount of frustration that authors have with publishers who are they're either basically all over you like a rash when things are going well. You never stop getting emails. Everything's wonderful. They, in the good old days, used to invite you to lunch and give you lots of, they give the authors lots of presents. And then when the sales start dipping and things start getting a bit bad, it suddenly gets a little quieter. And then you realize your inbox is not quite so full. And by the end of it, you realize you were one of their last year's hits. And so for me as an agent, I can't be that person, because I have to be there during good and bad and have to see it through. And many, many of my authors that I've started with have had a very up and down life. In fact, one author I've got at the moment who writes in the commercial women's field, called Lisa Jewell, who's a #1 bestseller now. But she had a whole period of 3 or 4 books where none of them were selling. And she was going to give up. And actually, when we sat down and talked about it, we realized it was because her books weren't they had the wrong covers on them. They literally, the design of the books didn't match the content of what she was writing. And it was almost as simple as that. But the publishers refused to change it because they didn't want to lose what they perceived as her readership. And I was saying her readership is so low at the moment, it doesn't matter. They'll come or they won't come. But let's try and reflect what she's written and publish it as such. And after a battle of 2 books where they didn't listen, they did listen on the 3rd, and happily that did go to #1, and she has a good career now, great career. She's in the New York Times. So in a way, that's another example of how a literary agent I mean, I'm talking about all the positives. There's lots of negatives, by the way. I'll get onto them later. But this is where you feel you've made an impact or a difference. And that's very exciting to me. And I think, you know, when I was thinking about what's a day in the life of a literary agent, it's kind of, I think the joy of it is that I don't know. Any day is different. You know, I got an email out of the blue once by 2 New Zealand packages. Now, a packager is someone who deals in another kind of publishing that I have nothing to do with, which is coffee table books. So I have very little knowledge about that area because it's a very technical and specific area of publishing. And I have no idea why they wrote to me. And I was about to delete it or just say to my assistant, please, could you just say it's not really for me, when there was something on the bottom of the email which said, by the way, we hold the rights to Nelson Mandela's archive. And I thought, how does 2 New Zealand packages hold the rights to Nelson Mandela's archive? And so just simply for that reason, I said, well, why don't you, if you're passing town, just come in and see me. And then I had the most amazing hour, I think, of my career, when these 2 amazing people told me the story of how they were absolutely embedded in Nelson Mandela's life, people around him. They built a trust because they'd done a coffee table book. But now they wanted to do something different, and they wanted help, and he wanted advice. And I thought, wow, that was an email well responded to. You know, so you just never know. And then we developed a relationship, and in the end, I went over to Johannesburg and met several of the people around him, and we created a book called Conversations with Myself, which was the first book really since Long Walk to Freedom that he'd written. That was taken from his letters. And then a few years later, we did they found, well, we sort of found a little bit of his unwritten memoir during his presidency, and then discovered more, and then created another book around it. And that was fabulous. So I suppose a day in the life is you just have to answer your email, and I'm afraid be open to any approaches, because you just never know. And in a way, that's what happened to me with John le Carré. He just called me up. His editor called me and said, "Are you looking for any new clients?" And I went, do you know what? I'm really packed. I'm just up to my eyes now. I'm afraid not. And he said, oh, okay. And I went, well, anyway, who was it? Who are you talking about? He said, well, John le Carré. I went, I'm there. Yeah, just give me the call. And then he said, well, at some point, David Cornwell is his name, might give you a call. And I just thought, wow, even just to meet him would be great. So, but I hadn't read John le Carré since I was at university. So, you know, I read a few of them, and I loved the films and you know, I wasn't an expert. So I immediately ordered up loads of books to read, and I was going to do nothing for the next 2 weeks and just read the whole backlist. And then an hour later, I got a phone call saying, hello, is this Jonny again? I went, yes. David Cornwell. Yeah. I went, oh my God. And then he said, should we meet that evening? So I had no chance to do any research, and I went to see him in his house in Hampstead, and we just got on like a house on fire. And that was, I don't know, 15 years ago. And it's been an extraordinary journey working with him. He is an extraordinary man and writer. But I'll hand it over to you to ask questions in a minute. But I just thought I would tell you how I got into it, because it is, as I said to you, an English and very posh business. And Curtis Brown is a very established, old-fashioned, or it was, agency. It's 120 years old now, and it was set up by an American who came over to London in the 1890s to basically place his American writers in the newspapers, because the Times was paying quite a lot of money for writers. And he thought there was an opportunity there. So he opened a little London office, and he started selling his journalists. And he started to pick up some British writers, like a young Winston Churchill. And he brought with him over the years writers like John Steinbeck and William Faulkner. I mean, he had an extraordinary list that was built up over 20 odd years. And I remember actually someone told me this story. I have no idea whether this is true, but I do like it, that he represented this playwright. It was in the 1920s, a really successful playwright, one of the kind of like the equivalent of Alan Ayckbourn or Andrew Lloyd Webber in his day, just all the time having West End hits. And he went for his lunch at the Garrick with this client. And the client said, I've got an idea for the next project. Spencer, I think his name's Spencer Curtis Brown, his name was. And he went, great, what is it? Thinking, you know, money rolling in. He said, I'd like to do a children's book. And Spencer Kirschbrand went, oh, God. All right, yeah. And I'd like to do it in verse. And he just thought, this is the end of his career. It's not only suicide for this guy, but also how is he going to make a living for the next 5 years if this guy's going to write a stupid verse children's book? And in the end, Winnie the Pooh was probably our biggest ever selling title in the 120-year history. And I think, and in fact, actually, Disney bought the Winnie the Pooh estate in 2000 for 200 million, so which was quite a lot of money in 2000. So I suppose this is really to say that agents know nothing, and we go with our clients because we support them and believe in them. But the idea that we would really know whether a playwright giving up his playwriting day could write Winnie the Pooh, or that any of the successes, I've had a few where they were not the books that I expected to succeed. And I think that's part of the charm and joy of it, really. And when I started, as I said, I was a failed actor. And that was obviously upsetting. And I had my midlife crisis at 24. And I essentially tried to get a job in publishing. And it was just, there was no way to get a job. There was no one around. They didn't answer my letters. And so in the end, I, with a friend, wrote a sitcom, actually. And we sent it to a few agents. And one agent did call us in and said, look, it's quite funny, but it's not going to work. And you better, start again. But nice for you to send it in. And I just said, are there any jobs here? So I was so desperate. And she said no. And then about 6 months later, she did write back to me and say, well, actually, the children's agent, the Winnie the Pooh agent, funnily enough, Elizabeth Stevens, is looking for an assistant. Do you want to try for that? So I tried and I got the job. And I was a terrible assistant for 2 years. And then I had this moment where after 2 years of really not enjoying it, but thinking, this is quite an interesting world, but I don't know anything about it. My boss left and said, look, I'm not taking you with you because I'm going to go to a small agency and I can't afford it. But listen, don't worry, I'm sure you'll be fine. And I was devastated. And I sat there in this big agency. It was so stuffy. And it had probably, it was living off its old clients. People like the Churchill estate, the Steinbecks, the Daphne du Mauriers, fantastic heritage, but nothing really new. In fact, probably the most famous client at the time was Antonia Fraser and David Lodge, who were great clients, but not huge. So I basically spent 2 months hiding. I went to work every day, and nobody noticed me because they'd forgotten that I was this guy's assistant who'd left. And I was, and so what I did is I just read every single manuscript that was sent in. And we used to have a thing called the slush pile, where you open a cupboard. It's normally where you put your coats in, and everybody from outside had sent their manuscripts in, and they were piled up high. And everybody ignored it because it was like, oh my God, what are we going to do with all these books, manuscripts? And it was terrible. And I had nothing else to do, so I was just reading them. And then one day I read a manuscript that I really enjoyed. And it was, I remember it very clearly. It was about a guy who takes revenge on it. He finds his old school reports in his attic, and it triggers a kind of psychotic episode because he decides to take revenge on his school teachers. And each chapter is a different chapter heading. So like a different subject, like geography, history, maths. And as he goes through each of these things, it was like a thriller, but it was funny, it was dark, it was very well written. And I just thought, what have I got to lose? So I called up 4 publishers and said, look, hi, I'm the new agent, Curtis Brown. You haven't met me yet, but don't worry. Here's this book. I gave them the pitch, and then I sent the book to them. And then I spent like a sleepless weekend. I remember it was in May 1995, thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get sacked, or I'm going to get done for fraud, because literally, I didn't know anything I was doing. And then I got back on the weekend, after the weekend, and on the answer machine, there was 4 messages, and they were from the 4 publishers, all saying, I read it over the weekend, I love it, I want to preempt. And I didn't even know what preempt meant. I mean, literally, I had to go to someone there and say, can you just take me through what I'm supposed to do now? And by the end of the week, this guy called Martin Bedford, who was, he'd been working at the Bradford and Telegraph Argus, I think up in near Ilkley, and on 75 quid a week. He was a journalist. By the end of the week, I'd got him £500,000 and we'd sold his film rights. And it was just an amazing week, totally crazy and a total piece of luck. And it changed his life, and it actually changed mine, because I went to my boss and said, I think you better promote me. He didn't, but he did eventually. And that was my entry into agenting. And actually what happened was, so when I sold this book, I was really excited about it. And you have to wait a year for the book to get, prepared, the cover, all the preparation for the bookshops. And I remember a year later in May, it was published. And I thought, this is going to win the Booker Prize. It's going to be a #1 bestseller. I couldn't wait for the film. And the publisher called me at the beginning of the week and said, well, I'm really sorry. It's not going to happen, is it? I said, what do you mean it's not going to happen? He said, well, read the papers. And unfortunately, that week, that terrible Dunblane massacre had happened. Remember the one in the schools with the children in Scotland? And of course, you can't publish a book about revenge on school teachers on the week of that. So that book never sold a copy. And so all my hopes were dashed and everything. And obviously, more importantly, the author's hopes were dashed. And it just showed me that, you've got no control over anything. But it was an experience. He then went on to write other novels, and he writes children's novels now. But, there is nothing predictable about publishing. And now my job is slightly different. I mean, I started off the first 10, 15 years really only on discovering new, launching new talent, having that exciting ride of building someone's career and seeing them work. And then, someone like Howard Jacobson, who obviously has a lot of experience and has written books before I met him. I didn't discover, but we've had a long and very good relationship over the last 20 years. So I have more experienced writers. And then I've also done a lot of nonfiction. And that is fascinating, because that really is, you go wherever the interesting story is. I can't remember how I met Gordon Brown. That was very interesting. I mean, he's a fascinating guy, and to work with him on his memoir, and I'm still working with him on various projects, actually, is a real inspiration. Whatever your politics, he's kind of, when you meet people at that level, the game is very, very high. And I'm working with people like some of the celebrities, I suppose, Bono from U2, who is an extraordinary man. He's not just a musician or a lyricist or a writer. He's also an activist and has raised hundreds of millions of dollars on debt relief. And those kind of, you just hear the stories that they tell you firsthand, stuff that you feel very privileged to be part of. So that is very exciting. And I'm always prepared to go on a new journey each year if I can. I'm very pleased to say that, and I hope everyone here will be buying his book, that I convinced Mel Brooks to do his autobiography at the tender age of 93. He resisted doing it for the last 35 years that everyone's been asking him. And I managed to convince him. So that was fun. And he's writing it at the moment with someone. And I think that will be, and just to hear his voice on the phone is just hilarious. I mean, you just somehow that to me is a real joy. So there are lots of very positive things. There are lots of negatives as well. And some of the negatives are that I can't hand these books in to you to force you to buy them. I rely on a publisher. And however much money I get from a publisher, whatever the commitment that they promise me, it's still their call. And that is frustrating, because I would like to take it over, frankly, because they often, they have too many other books to worry about. When there's genuine enthusiasm. And in a sense, my job really is to be at the head of the chain of enthusiasm. I've got to be the one that keeps reminding them why they bought this book a year ago, or in some cases with nonfiction, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, when it's a big history. And that is frustrating. There's a frustration with bookshops, what they stock, how they stock them, when they give up on books, what risks they take. Again, out of my control. That's a publisher's relationship with a bookseller. And authors feel very frustrated about that. Publicity. Often a publisher doesn't know the right way to handle an author. I remember with Howard Jacobson, when I first met him, I said, the problem is, Howard, he was complaining about his sales. And I said to him, well, because you're everywhere. said, you're on TV, on the Late Show, you're on newspapers regularly, on a column. Why would anyone need to pay money to buy a novel to hear your voice if they can hear it all the time and you're on the radio? And for about 3 years, he stopped. He held back on what he was doing. And it coincided with a period where the book sales started to rise. And in a way that did. So sometimes people are too accessible, and sometimes they just need a different sort of piece of advice on that. And I think that's kind of the overview. I hope that's given you a little bit of a sense of what a literary agent is. And it's a fabulous job. It's an unknown job. And I would encourage any of your children or grandchildren who want to go into a creative industry, despite what's going on with COVID, it's a really interesting and vibrant area to work in. The creative industries are worth £100 billion to the economy, or they were before COVID. And, that's extraordinary. That's not a small thing, and it's a cultural export. It's a part of our identity. And a lot of people don't even think about publishing. And I didn't. I mean, as I told you, it was very posh and I remember one of the partners at Curtis Brown, this very grand lady called Diana Baring, who was related to Baring Bank. And she looked after Freddie Forsyth and a couple of other big authors. And she had heard that I was trying to get a job outside of Curtis Brown. And she took me out to lunch. And I thought, wow, I'm getting free lunch. And she took me to the Cafe Royal. And so I went to the Cafe Royal, and I was sitting there and I was having my soup. And she said to me, Jonny, it's so important that we keep people like you, who are not English, Jewish. And I thought, oh, right, okay. Now, if I'm a man of principle, I would have stormed out of that restaurant and told her to stick her job. But I'm afraid I finished the soup and stayed at Curtis Brown. And now my role is to be the literary agent of the clients I've got, and also to run the company. And when I started, there were about 35 people, and now we have nearly 250. So we've grown, into a big agency, and that's because we do actors, film directors, theatre writers, not just, well, I don't say not just, but I mean not only. Publishing writers, but that's my area. So I think I've rattled on. Is that okay? Does anyone want to ask any questions or does that help?
Thank you very, very much indeed. I am sure there are going to be hundreds of questions. So rather than the usual cacophony, as soon as I unmute, I would ask anybody with a question to raise their hand, and then perhaps I can decide or you can decide who's going to ask you a question, and they can unmute. So please raise a hand if you've got a question. Lydia, can you unmute yourself? There we go, Lydia.
Thank you. Really interesting. Thank you for the talk. I wondered two things, really. One was how many authors you had in your stable at any one time, and what makes that change, and does it go up and down within parameters? I think I'll just, thank you.
Thank you for asking that. I have about 50 or so clients at the moment. Probably when I was starting off, there was more like 70 to 100. And then what happens is that authors come and go. So some are one-offs, like I doubt Roger Daltrey or Phil Collins, who I've done their autobiographies, will be releasing their book of poetry. So I think that's safe to say is a one-off. But in terms of, my heart tends to be in fiction, and those, and I like to think if I have writers that cover the genres I'm interested in, I don't want to have too many in the same area because they end up competing with each other, and it's not a great feeling. So I would like to control that. So I try and look at my list as like a publishing list. If I was a publisher, I would say I need a celebrity, I need serious nonfiction, I need children's, I need cookery and whatever. And so I'm quite a generalist. So I have that. I would say the addiction of being a literary agent is the discovery element, and so I will always open to finding new. But luckily, I now have a lot of colleagues who have more space and time than me, and I will always happy to pass them on to the right agent because, you know, I just want them to be at Curtis Brown. So I would say I'm probably not going to expand it much beyond, but I took on a couple of new writers a couple of years ago and a year ago. So but it's a small amount. And we have a creative writing school, by the way, which is called CBC, and that has become extraordinarily successful. And we only set it up a few years ago, and we've had now 100 students get publishing deals through going through that course. So that's another way of us finding talent. And yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you very much. More questions? Helen?
I possibly missed something at the beginning, but when you get a script sent, does it have to be complete, or is it part of a book? Or, I mean, the author will probably think it's complete, but...
Well, we actually have a system now, which is quite transparent, which says, it's an online system, which says, could you bring in 3 chapters and a synopsis? And then you fill in the questionnaire about what kind of book it is. So that just helps us so that we get away from the world of piled up manuscripts sitting in the closet, which is not what we want. So that tends to happen. And what happens is that gets read, every single manuscript gets sent in, and then it's filtered. And then if there's something with promise, we'll ask for more. But if the problem most people have is they send their book to the wrong person. So, you know, someone writing a military history sends it to an agent specializing in romance, you know, they're going to get a rejection. So we're trying to educate people to really target who to send to, so they don't waste their own time, because rejection is so tough, you know, and to know a real rejection to a pointless rejection is kind of crucial. So yes, 3 chapters, a synopsis. And for me, the most important thing, I'm afraid, is the letter. If the letter is clear, well written, shows a little bit of personality, understands the book that they're actually sending, then all that says to me, okay, I'll read. But if the letter goes on for ages, it's a little unfocused, they don't really know what they've written, and a lot of writers don't know what they've written, then I tend to be a bit impatient.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Ellen Naftalin had a question.
Yes. Who makes the decision when a hardback should become a paperback? I'd also like to ask the question, you said it's a great thing to do, and you'd encourage us to encourage our children and our grandchildren to get into the field. But we all know that the younger generation spend an awful lot of time on screens and don't tend to read as much as we might like them to. And I just wondered what you thought about the future of publishing generally is.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first question is easy to answer. The publishing contract says that the hardback appears 12 months from delivery, or before, or up to 12 months of delivery, and then the paperback is up to 12 months after the hardback. So not every book is published in hardback, because it's quite a hard market to break, but if you are in hardback, you always have a paperback, and that's called volume rights. That's what we sell to the publisher. We're essentially selling the license for them to publish this book in all formats for 70 years after the death of that author. So it's a huge, you know, copyright, that is the law of copyright. And that is a huge value. And so that's why it's so important to get that right. But yes, paperback follows hardback. And the publisher with the agent will decide when. The future of reading, I mean, yes, you're right. You know, there are so many more distractions than there were when I was a kid. And so it's not comparable to say to my kids, why aren't you reading more? It's up to the books to be a bit better and to attract them. And the fact is, all the data is saying that this country still reads a hell of a lot. Now, it may be skewed to an elderly readership, but the values of people having a house full of books and of being seen reading do permeate, and people do tend to carry on reading if their parents read. They may have a gap between the ages of 13 and 26, but I'm finding that the 25s to 40s are reading a lot, and publishing, you know, is thriving. I mean, maybe not at this moment, but there are no underlying problems I mean, everyone thought there'd be the death of publishing when Amazon entered the field, and suddenly all these self-published books were very cheap. And what happened was even more books were sold. It's just that they were all over there. And a lot of people didn't want to read those self-published books at £1 on Amazon, but they had a right to be there. People still went back to bookshops, and the print book is still very strong. So I'm naively optimistic about that. I don't see that as being a problem.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Any more, Nigel?
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and some of those names really rang bells. But what have you turned down you always regret?
J.K. Rowling. No. I didn't turn down J.K. Rowling. I don't know. I mean, there have been books that I've turned down that I then read a year later, went for a lot of money in an auction, and I was kicking myself, but then didn't go on to sell a lot in the bookshop. And to me, that's the only signifier that matters, because in the end, whether my business, I get a lot of money for an author or I don't, is irrelevant to the reader. All that matters is what is a bestseller and what is an enduring book. So in terms of those, I had a call from a very talented writer who I just didn't take seriously. I just was too busy, and I said, oh, please do send it in. And then she went on to win the Booker Prize. And I was thinking, I should have taken that a bit more seriously. So sometimes people at different stages in their career approach you and you're just occupied somewhere else. But in terms of regrets, I don't think like that. I always move forward, I'm afraid, like a shark.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? Yes. Can we unmute you? I got MJD and I can't recognize the name. So,
Leonard?
right, please unmute yourself if you can.
That's not us. Do you want to ask your
Oh, there we are. Right.
Fine.
You have a question.
Good afternoon. I notice from time to time quite major authors suddenly are published or represented by different people. Is there no long-term contract between an author once you accept him or her and their future production?
There is a contract, a client agreement letter, but it allows either side to terminate it. And all you need is 60 days notice. You can't. What most agencies do is they keep the contracts they've negotiated. And so authors may have left Curtis Brown, but we still have the benefit of the contract's ongoing life. And that's the standard practice in agenting. So authors must be free to go to wherever they need to be represented best, but their contracts stay. Absolutely.
Great. Levin.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a most interesting lecture. A question I would like to ask, if possible. This is Leonard here. I don't know if you got my name
Yes,
there.
I can see Leonard. Hi.
Yes.
Hello,
Yeah.
how are you? Thank you. Question is this: what happens when you have a book, like, if I may mention Dan Brown, and it's translated into other languages? How does that system work? And can you make sure that they use the right word, instead of the wrong word?
That's very good. Very good question.
Instead of celibacy, it should be celebrate.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, funny enough, I've had a lot of problems with translations that have not been good, and only realized it years later. And so you can have an author who's seen as very, very high literary in one market, but then in Romania seen as trash, sort of airport read. And you're thinking, how did that happen? And then someone tells you that it's written so badly that no one thought that it was a book of quality. So the translation is a really key issue now. But unfortunately, you don't have much control on that. But to answer your question about how translation works, rights work, that's a very integral part of my business. So I would say about a third of my revenue is based on the rights sold in different countries. And I can have many authors who are much bigger and more successful abroad than they are actually in the UK where they live. So for example, David Lodge, who I grew up reading at university, who I represent, he's one of the biggest authors in France. And actually Howard Jacobson is very, very big in Italy. And so it's very odd. And it's very odd where some people are very successful. And I don't know whether anyone's read Jojo Moyes, you know, but she's a very successful author, and she is by far the biggest market is Germany. So for us, and Rosamund Pilcher, when she was alive, she was our biggest client because she was so huge in Germany, France, Spain, Italy. So to be honest, we're very English centric and everything about America and the UK, but really an author's life and career can be totally transformed by different countries. So for us, I have a whole team of people who sell the manuscript at the same time as I'm selling mine to the UK and the US, all around the world.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Irene, would you like to let me see if I can unmute you. No, I can't. Irene, if you can unmute yourself.
Thought I had.
Yes.
Yes, you have. Hello.
Can I ask you whether you have time for reading for pleasure? And I've just read a book called Writers and Lovers by Lily King, which describes your sort of work as well. At the
Oh, really?
Yes. And I just wonder whether you read yourself, just for the hell of it.
Yes, I do. I think in the last few months, I found it really hard to read. I don't know why. I don't know whether that's a common feeling, but I found that during this lockdown, I'm finding it hard to concentrate on fiction. So I've been reading non-fiction, and I enjoy that. I'm also quite addicted to Netflix and long-form television. I think it's a brilliant form, and sometimes better than books. So I will go anywhere where I think there's excellence in storytelling. Sometimes there's podcasts. So I'm quite, but yeah, it's tricky because when I go on holiday, I don't take any of my author's work or any of Curtis Brown's work. I deliberately go outside. And I think I used to read 2 or 3 books, well, 2 books a week on the side, as well as my work. And I don't do that. I haven't got time for that anymore. So I am, I'm a bit behind. But yeah, no, I love reading. I mean, I still love it. The point is, once you're in a good book, there's nothing better. The problem is getting into a good book. There's a lot of all right books.
Yes.
And we've got to be in the world of the good books.
Do you give up on books if you're not enjoying
Yes, always. That is a huge liberation in my life. I stopped after being a student where I painfully went through all these long books. Yeah. I now feel, but sometimes I make really bad mistakes by giving up too early, because I hear people keep telling me about books they loved and I gave up, and I'm thinking maybe I was wrong here. But books are so subjective, aren't they? It's totally about your mood, your generosity of spirit at that moment, your mental well-being, and books can, if you hit the right book at the right moment in your mood and it just unlocks something, I think it's magical. That to me is the moment, and that you can't control. Yeah. But I am now going back to those classics as well, because I just like to go back to what I know is sure, it's guaranteed.
Well, thank you for producing some of my best friends, which are books.
Oh, isn't that lovely? Yes, thank you. Keep reading, keep buying.
Philippa, can we have 2 last questions, and then we can perhaps let Jonny go and discover yet another author, but Philippa Ackerman.
Yeah.
Hi, Jonny. It's actually Lawrence, not Philippa. It's Philippa's laptop. That's why it has her name.
Hi, Lawrence.
John le Carré. Why would an established writer with a massive following change agents?
Now, that is a good question, and I wonder how I can answer that by telling the truth. I think what happened was that he is a ferociously energetic and ambitious writer, and his age is not a impediment to that. And I think he had been with an agent for 20 years, and that agent was slowing down, probably his contemporary, and was probably thinking of retiring, and he wasn't. And I think he looked around and saw some 40-year-old kid on the block and thought, this guy's in it for at least 20 more years, so why don't I back this horse? That's my gut feeling, is he took a risk by moving. And
it's a major risk.
Yes, and actually what came with him, which was his entire backlist. So it wasn't just the odd book. So I look after all his 25 books that go back 60 years, and all his film rights and his TV stuff and theatre. So it's a very big job. But he is, you know, he really, what I find amazing of him is that he's also a very acute businessman. He's not just a thinker and a writer and he understands the business of publishing, which is a great help, because, you know, some agents think authors should just be grateful and sit back and collect their royalty check and write the books. But for me, it's a partnership. I have to be with someone who gets it. And he, boy oh boy, he gets it. Every cover, every blurb, we discuss in every territory. So you can imagine it's sort of like, and when he delivers a book, the last book he delivered had 17 drafts. You know, so and this man's 88.
Wow.
So there's hope for all of us.
Indeed.
Great. Thank you very much. Can we have a last question? Last question from anybody? Yes, Anthony. Can you unmute yourself? This thing does not seem to want to unmute you.
Hello, it's Sue Marcus here.
Oh, all right, we've got Sue Marcus instead. Sorry, Anthony.
Okay. I wondered whether you were doing anything about all the cuts in the public libraries, because obviously people learn about books from looking at public libraries. They don't just go to the bookshop. And libraries are so important for all sections of our society. The young can be what's the word? The young need to look at free books so that they can buy them when they get a bit more money.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. In fact, that's how I got into reading, by going down to the library and taking books away. It's pretty grim. I mean, I can't say that we're doing anything proactive, because it's a publisher's relationship with the library, and the authors don't have. I mean, what we do is we set up events, and we try and support book publication launches by doing them in libraries, so we can attract attention to libraries and also attractive events so that people want to be there. But in terms of literacy drives, we do that. But the fact is, they're closing so many libraries, and that it may well become a thing of the past in a few years' time. And I don't know, apart from us protesting and trying to support our local library, but every time I go into the Barnet Library, the one at the end of my road and East Finchley High Road, it's always empty. So it's hard to argue it if people aren't going.
Great, Anthony. We can perhaps squeeze a last question in.
Okay, thank you. Jonny, do you sit and read a book in work and think that would be a good film? Or is that not your job?
No, that's my job as well. Although I don't then go and sell the film rights. What I'll do is I'll go down to my colleague in the film department and say, this you should prioritize, because I think, you know, this pitch will work. And sometimes I'll send it to a screenwriter or an actor and say, I think this book would be good for you. And then if they start getting involved, there's a bit of momentum. But we have someone who sells what's called book to film rights. So every book potentially could be a film. And then obviously every author thinks that would make a good film. But yeah, that's very much part of the rights that we look after. You know, audio, ebook, publishing rights, film rights, podcast, all those things derive from that story. And it's up to me to try and exploit it.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Ed.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating, interesting, exciting and stimulating talk. I am sure you're going to have a large queue of people for your creative writing course all the way down your road. And I hope you find lots and lots and lots of bestsellers among them. So thank you very, very much indeed. Before everybody goes, a couple of announcements. One is that in 2 weeks' time, on the 17th, not on the 17th, on the 1st of July, Judge Lawrence Cohen will be telling us all about judging in the coronavirus era and the differences in being a judge now as opposed to 6 months back. And then 2 weeks later, Ruth Sober, our own Ruth Sober, will be saying if it's Tuesday, actually it won't be, it'll be Wednesday, but if it's Tuesday, it's Zoo Day. And she will be describing some of her rather more hair-raising adventures in the local zoo where she was an educational assistant, I think. And then 2 weeks later, we're delighted on the 29th of July to welcome Rafi Berg, the BBC News website Middle East editor, who will be telling us the true story of Mossad's fake diving school in the Red Sea. And with that, I will remind you of the food bank and the soup kitchen. And once again, thank Jonny very, very much indeed for an absolutely fantastic talk. So thank you very much, Jonny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And goodbye to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Sue. Sue.
Did Samuel go? I presume he did. He could phone out asking what he thought.